A grand church wedding, a picture-perfect bride, and a charismatic preacher beloved by an entire town. It was supposed to be the beginning of a lifelong love story. But behind the vows, the prayers, and the carefully crafted smiles, a dark and twisted secret was waiting to explode. On their wedding night, Amelia Collins, a devoted young woman who dreamed of a faithful union, stumbled upon a horrifying betrayal that would shatter her world. Her husband, Pastor Benjamin Harlow, a man revered as a moral pillar of the community, was caught in a moment so shocking, it would set off a chain of events that no one could have foreseen. Within days, betrayal turned to rage, and rage turned to murder. What should have been the happiest night of her life became a nightmare, leaving a small southern town to unravel the horrifying truth hiding beneath their faith and trust. If you're intrigued by stories of betrayal, manipulation, and justice, stay tuned as we uncover every chilling detail of this tragic case. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping true crime stories that reveal the dark side of human nature. In a quiet southern town, nestled among rolling hills and swaying oak trees, life revolved around faith. The church was more than just a building, it was the very heart of the community. Sunday mornings were sacred, marked by packed pews and the sound of gospel hymns echoing through the air. Here, people found purpose, belonging, and guidance, trusting their spiritual leaders without question. Amelia Collins grew up in this world of unwavering faith. At 26, she was a woman of deep conviction, raised in a devout Christian household that cherished tradition and moral values. Known for her kindness and humility, Amelia was a pillar of the community herself, someone others looked to as an example of grace and virtue. Then there was Pastor Benjamin Harlow. At 37, he was the charismatic preacher who could command a room with his voice alone. His sermons were powerful, his presence magnetic, and his ability to inspire trust unparalleled. To the congregation, Benjamin wasn't just a preacher, he was a beacon of moral authority, a man who seemed to live and breathe the virtues he preached. Among the many who looked up to Benjamin was Nathan Collins, Amelia's 20-year-old younger brother. Nathan had always been different, a young man searching for his place in a world that often felt unforgiving. Struggling with his identity and desperate for answers, he turned to Benjamin for guidance. The pastor became a mentor, a confidant, and, unbeknownst to everyone, the source of Nathan's deepest turmoil. It was in this tightly knit community of faith and tradition, under the surface of smiles and Sunday bests, that a storm began to brew, one that would tear apart families, shatter trust, and expose dark secrets hidden behind the pulpit. The wedding was the kind of event that people in the small southern town would talk about for years. The church was transformed into a vision of perfection, with rows of pristine white roses lining the aisle and golden ribbons tied to every pew. The chandelier above cast a warm, heavenly glow, making the ceremony feel almost ethereal. Guests, dressed in their Sunday best, filled every seat and stood in the back, craning their necks to get a glimpse of the bride and groom. Amelia, with her long, flowing lace gown and delicate veil, looked like a vision of purity. Her smile was radiant as she clutched her father's arm, walking down the aisle to the sound of a choir singing, "Amazing Grace." Benjamin Harlow, standing at the altar in his tailored suit, seemed every bit the perfect groom, calm, composed, and exuding confidence as he waited for his bride. The vows were heartfelt, the prayers deeply moving, and the reception that followed was a celebration of joy and faith. Families embraced, children played on the church lawn, and congregants offered tearful congratulations to the newlyweds. Benjamin and Amelia were the picture of a perfect couple, holding hands and exchanging glances that seemed to promise a lifetime of happiness. As the night wore on, the couple said their goodbyes to cheers and applause. Stepping into a sleek black sedan adorned with white ribbons and "Just Married" signs, they left for the honeymoon cabin, a gift from the church and a symbol of the community's love and support. The cabin was everything Amelia had dreamed of, secluded, luxurious, and romantic. Nestled deep in the woods, it boasted floor-to-ceiling windows that framed a breathtaking view of the star-filled sky. Inside, the warm light of a crackling fireplace danced across plush furniture and rich wooden floors. A bottle of champagne sat chilling on the counter, while rose petals were scattered on the bed in an elegant arrangement. For Amelia, this was the start of her fairy tale, a peaceful, private retreat where she and Benjamin could begin their new life together. After unpacking their bags and sharing a quiet toast, Amelia stepped outside to take in the cool night air. The forest was serene, with the faint sound of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. She stood on the porch, letting the day's emotions wash over her, joy, excitement, and a touch of nervous anticipation for what lay ahead. She had only been gone a few minutes, but when she stepped back inside the cabin, her life would change forever. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, and as Amelia approached, she noticed the low murmur of voices. Pushing the door open, her heart stopped at the sight before her. Benjamin and Nathan were in an intimate embrace, their bodies close, their expressions too familiar to be mistaken. Nathan's hands trembled as he tried to pull away, but it was too late. Amelia had seen everything. For a moment, there was only silence. Amelia stood frozen, her brain struggling to process what her eyes were seeing. Then, the silence shattered. What is this?" she screamed, her voice raw with disbelief and fury. Her eyes darted between Benjamin, the man she had vowed to spend her life with, and Nathan, her younger brother, who now looked like a scared child caught in something far beyond his control. Nathan's face crumpled as he stammered, "Amelia, I can explain," but his voice faltered under the weight of her piercing glare. Benjamin stepped forward, his expression a mix of guilt and calculated calm. "Amelia, let me explain," he said, his voice steady but desperate. "Explain." Amelia's voice cracked as tears streamed down her face. "You lied to me. Both of you. How could you do this to me?" The room felt stifling, the air thick with tension. Nathan sank to the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, while Benjamin tried to take control of the situation. "Amelia, listen to me," he pleaded, his voice growing firmer, "this is not what you think. We can work through this." "Work through this?" she spat, her hands trembling as she clenched them into fists. "You disgust me. Both of you. I gave you everything, Benjamin. Everything. And you," she turned her gaze to Nathan, her voice breaking. "You were supposed to be my brother. My family." Amelia couldn't take it anymore. Overcome with rage, betrayal, and heartbreak, she spun on her heel and stormed out of the cabin. The door slammed behind her, the echo cutting through the still night air. Inside the cabin, the tension exploded. Nathan began to cry, his sobs muffled by his hands. "What have we done?" he whispered. Benjamin, pacing the room, rubbed his hands over his face, his calm demeanor beginning to crack. "We'll figure this out," he muttered, more to himself than to Nathan. "We can't let this destroy us." But outside, in the darkness of the woods, Amelia's world was already shattered, her trust irreparably broken. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of the nightmare. The morning sunlight streamed through the cabin's windows, but for Amelia, it brought no warmth, only the cold reality of what she had uncovered. Her heart was heavy with a storm of emotions, betrayal, disgust, confusion. She spent the night pacing the woods, trying to make sense of it all, but the only thing she felt now was the need for answers. She couldn't avoid the confrontation any longer. Inside the cabin, Benjamin sat at the kitchen table, his Bible open in front of him as if trying to find solace in Scripture. His usual confident demeanor was gone, replaced by an air of unease. Nathan lingered by the window, his face pale, his hands trembling as he avoided making eye contact. Amelia walked in, her footsteps heavy, her eyes locked on Benjamin. "We need to talk," she said, her voice sharp and unwavering. Benjamin looked up, his expression guarded. "Amelia, I know you're upset, but we can." "No," she cut him off, her voice rising. "No more excuses. No more lies. I want the truth, Benjamin. All of it. Benjamin sighed, leaning back in his chair. For a moment, he seemed to wrestle with himself, but then his shoulders slumped. "Fine," he said, his voice low. "You deserve the truth." Amelia's heart pounded in her chest as Benjamin began to speak. He told her about how his relationship with Nathan started years ago, when Nathan had come to him for counseling. Nathan, struggling with his identity and desperate for guidance, had been vulnerable. Benjamin had positioned himself as a mentor, a spiritual guide, but somewhere along the way, that trust had been twisted into something darker. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," Benjamin said, his voice filled with hollow regret. "Nathan needed someone to help him, to guide him. I tried to be that person, but," he trailed off, his words hanging in the air like a confession and a justification all at once. Amelia turned to Nathan, who stood frozen by the window. "Is that true?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. Nathan's lips quivered as tears filled his eyes. I didn't know what to do," he whispered. "I was scared. He said it was okay, that it was part of finding myself. I believed him." His voice cracked as he added, "I thought he cared about me. I didn't know how to say no." Amelia's fists clenched at her sides as the full weight of Benjamin's betrayal sank in. Her husband, a man she had trusted, a man revered by the community, had preyed on her brother's vulnerability, using his authority to manipulate and control him. And she had been nothing more than a pawn in his game, a convenient cover to protect his image. "You used him," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "You took advantage of him when he needed help the most. And then you used me, married me, just to keep up your perfect little facade. How dare you?" "Amelia, it's not like that," Benjamin protested, standing up from the table. "I love you." "I love me," she spat, her voice rising to a shout. "You don't know the first thing about love, Benjamin. You're a liar. A predator. And you think you can hide behind God and the church to excuse what you've done. No. Not anymore." Nathan's sobs filled the silence as Amelia glared at Benjamin, her anger boiling over. "You've ruined everything," she said, her voice shaking. "Everything I believed in. Everything Nathan believed in. And for what? To protect your reputation. To keep your power." Benjamin took a step toward her, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Amelia, please. Let's just calm down and talk about this. We can fix it. We can move past this." But Amelia shook her head, her eyes blazing with determination. "No, Benjamin. You don't get to manipulate me the way you manipulated him. This ends now. I'm going to the church. I'm going to tell everyone what you've done." Panic flashed across Benjamin's face. "Amelia, don't do this," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You don't understand the consequences." "Oh, I understand perfectly," she shot back. "And I'm done being silent. You don't get to hide behind lies anymore." With that, she turned and walked out of the cabin, slamming the door behind her. Inside, Benjamin stood frozen, his mind racing. Nathan collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. The fragile facade Benjamin had worked so hard to maintain was crumbling, and he knew that if Amelia followed through on her threat, his world, and his carefully constructed image, would come crashing down. That night, the air in the cabin was thick with tension. The soft crackling of the fire in the hearth did little to ease the suffocating silence that hung between them. Amelia stood by the door, her hands shaking with fury, but her resolve was unshakable. She was done with the lies, done with the facade Benjamin had built. Benjamin paced the room, his mind spinning as he tried to formulate a plan, any plan that could stop her from exposing him. His usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced with the frantic energy of a man who could see his empire crumbling before his eyes. He knew that if Amelia went to the church with the truth, everything, his position, his reputation, the trust he had worked so hard to build, would be lost. Amelia, please, he pleaded, his voice strained. Don't do this. You don't understand what you're threatening. The consequences will be far worse than you can imagine. Amelia, her face pale with rage, stood her ground. You think you can scare me into silence? You think you can manipulate me like you did Nathan? She spat, her voice rising. I'm done, Benjamin. This ends tonight. Benjamin's eyes flickered with desperation. You don't understand. If you go public with this, it will ruin everything. You'll destroy me, you'll destroy Nathan, you'll destroy your entire family. But Amelia's expression hardened. You already destroyed us. You destroyed everything we ever had. You preyed on Nathan. You used me as a cover for your secret life. She took a step forward, her voice unwavering. I will expose you, Benjamin. I won't be your pawn any longer. The words hit Benjamin like a slap to the face. His chest tightened, and in that moment, a primal fear surged through him, the fear of losing control. The rage inside him boiled over, and with a violent snap, he lunged toward Amelia, grabbing her by the arms and shaking her. Don't you dare, he snarled, his face twisted with fury. Don't you dare threaten me. Amelia struggled in his grip, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to push him off, but his strength was overpowering. Let go of me, she cried, her voice breaking. Benjamin's anger erupted, and before Amelia could react, he shoved her hard against the wall. The force of the impact knocked the wind out of her, and for a moment, she was dazed. But when she looked up, she saw the rage in Benjamin's eyes, the same man who had once promised to cherish and protect her, now standing before her as something else entirely. Amelia. He growled, his voice cold and low. You've made me do this. He grabbed a nearby cord from the cabin's old-fashioned lampshade. Without warning, he wrapped it around her neck, pulling tight. Amelia's hands instinctively went to her throat, clawing at the cord, but the pressure was too much. The world around her began to fade, her vision blurring as the air left her lungs. Nathan, standing by the window, had been frozen in shock, unable to process what was unfolding before his eyes. His heart raced in his chest, and his legs felt like lead, weighing him down. The fight, the violence, was too much for him to comprehend. He opened his mouth to scream, to run to her aid, but the words stuck in his throat. He could only watch, horrified, as his sister's life slipped away. Her body went limp, and Benjamin, consumed by the dark heat of his own panic and rage, released the cord only when he was certain Amelia was dead. For a moment, Benjamin stood there, his breath ragged, his hands trembling. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, with a look of cold realization, he turned to Nathan, who was still standing frozen by the window, tears streaming down his face. You've got to help me, Benjamin said, his voice urgent. You can't let this get out. You don't want your life ruined too, do you? Nathan's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at his sister's lifeless body. What do you mean? His voice was barely a whisper, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. Benjamin took a step toward him, his eyes wild with desperation. We need to get rid of her body. Make it look like an accident. The church, the congregation, they can never find out the truth. You can't let them. Nathan's hands shook as he wiped his tears away, his mind spinning. He was trapped, both terrified of what Benjamin would do if he didn't help and horrified by what he had just witnessed. The man who had manipulated him for so long was now asking him to help cover up the most heinous crime. I can't do this, Nathan whispered, his voice trembling. Yes, you can, Benjamin insisted, grabbing him by the shoulders and shaking him. You don't have a choice. You're part of this now. We both are. And if you don't help me, they'll come for you too. Nathan looked down at his sister's body, the weight of what was happening crashing down on him. He was trapped in a nightmare that Benjamin had created, and now he was being forced to help him destroy the only person who could have stopped it all. Tears streamed down Nathan's face as Benjamin led him out of the cabin to begin the grim task of staging Amelia's death as a tragic accident. They would claim she had fallen while hiking, but as they worked together in a twisted silence, both of them knew the truth: there was no accident here, only betrayal, violence, and the death of the woman who had once trusted them both. Benjamin and Nathan worked quickly, their minds focused on one thing: covering up the brutal reality of Amelia's death. They decided to stage it as a tragic hiking accident, hoping that the serene, isolated cabin nestled in the woods would lend itself to their fabricated story. The first task was moving Amelia's lifeless body. Benjamin, his hands shaking with a mix of guilt and panic, helped Nathan carry her to the nearby trailhead. They made sure to position her in a way that made it appear she had lost her footing while hiking, tumbling down a small incline near the cabin. The surrounding woods would help mask any signs of struggle or violence. They placed her carefully on the ground, her body positioned at an awkward angle, just as if she had slipped and fallen. Benjamin made sure to move branches and leaves to make the scene look convincing, as though Amelia had been hiking alone and tragically lost her balance. Next, they smeared dirt on her clothing, making it appear as though she had fallen further into the wilderness before succumbing to her injuries. The scene was eerily quiet, and for a moment, both men stood over her, the weight of what they were doing pressing down on them. But there was no turning back now. With everything in place, they returned to the cabin. They wiped down any surfaces they had touched and tried to erase any trace of their involvement in the crime. Benjamin's mind raced, trying to anticipate how the authorities would react. They had to make sure the timeline fit perfectly, so it would be hard for anyone to question their version of events. The next morning, Benjamin drove to the nearest town to report his wife's accident. His voice cracked with fake sorrow as he told the authorities that Amelia had gone hiking on her own and somehow fallen, her injuries fatal. His account was carefully rehearsed, delivered with a sense of grief that was nearly too perfect. He even mentioned how she had been so excited to spend time in nature, making it sound like a peaceful escape from the stress of their recent wedding. The sheriff and a team of deputies went to search for Amelia's body. They found her quickly, just as Benjamin had described. Amelia's body was cold, lifeless, and the cause of death seemed to be a head injury from the fall. There were no signs of foul play at the scene, just the tragic, simple accident Benjamin had orchestrated. The investigation moved slowly, but the authorities seemed satisfied with the story. Meanwhile, Benjamin went about organizing the funeral. The church, ever loyal to their beloved pastor, rallied around him in his time of grief. The town was devastated by Amelia's death. She had been a beloved figure in the community, a woman full of life, faith, and promise. The funeral was a somber affair. The church was packed with mourners, many of whom were in tears over the loss of a young woman they had known and admired. Benjamin stood at the pulpit, his face twisted with grief, his voice trembling as he spoke about Amelia's unwavering faith, her kindness, and the future they had planned together. "It's hard to imagine life without her," Benjamin said, his voice cracking. "Amelia was the light of my life, my partner in every way. I was blessed to have her by my side, even if it was only for a short time. But now, we must remember her for the beautiful person she was and the love she gave." Tears ran down his face as he spoke, and the congregation sniffled in sympathy. To them, Benjamin was a man of God, a man whose heart was shattered by the loss of his wife. They couldn't possibly imagine the truth that lay beneath his words. Nathan, standing near the back of the church, kept his head down, his eyes empty as he watched his sister's casket being lowered into the ground. He had participated in this lie, helped Benjamin cover up the murder, but he couldn't escape the overwhelming weight of guilt that pressed on him. Every glance from the mourners, every whispered sympathy, felt like a knife in his chest. He knew he was complicit in something horrible, but his fear of Benjamin kept him silent. As the service ended, Benjamin embraced Nathan, whispering words of comfort, though they both knew that their actions could never truly be washed away. They had staged Amelia's death, but the consequences of their choices had only just begun to unravel. The town mourned the loss of Amelia Collins, believing her death to be a tragic accident, unaware that the man they trusted most, the pastor they revered, was the very one responsible for her brutal end. And though the truth was buried beneath layers of lies, it would not stay hidden forever. The investigation would soon turn, and the world would learn of the dark, twisted truth that had shattered not only a marriage but an entire community. The peaceful small-town facade began to crack as law enforcement started digging deeper into Amelia's death. At first, everything appeared to fit the tragic accident narrative. The authorities had followed the story Benjamin and Nathan had crafted so carefully. Amelia had fallen while hiking alone, and the rugged terrain made it plausible that she could have suffered a fatal head injury. But as days passed, the inconsistencies in the story began to surface. Local sheriff's deputies, used to the occasional accident but not unfamiliar with the small details that didn't quite add up, started questioning the validity of Benjamin's account. Amelia's body, while found in a secluded part of the woods near the cabin, showed signs that didn't align with a simple fall. Suspicion surrounding Amelia's death grew as inconsistencies in the story began to surface, prompting authorities to take action. Weeks after her burial, a court order was issued for her exhumation, and her body was carefully unearthed from its final resting place. An autopsy was conducted, revealing startling evidence: bruises on her neck that didn't align with the supposed hiking accident. This crucial finding would set the stage for a deeper investigation, leading to the unraveling of the dark secrets buried beneath the surface of the town. The first red flag appeared during the initial autopsy. Amelia's cause of death had been declared a traumatic brain injury, but there were bruises around her neck that didn't match the description of a fall. They were deep, distinct marks, inconsistent with any injury that could be sustained from hitting the ground. They looked far more like the imprint of hands that had strangled her before she fell. Sheriff Dawson, a seasoned investigator with a sharp eye for details, was the first to notice the bruising. He ordered a second examination of the body, focusing on the marks around her neck. Something didn't sit right with him. "The bruising is too deliberate," Dawson remarked to his team, his voice tinged with suspicion. "This wasn't an accident. Someone tried to choke her before she fell." When the autopsy results were revealed, it confirmed the sheriff's growing concern. Amelia had been strangled. The injuries to her neck were severe and not consistent with any fall or hiking accident. It was clear, someone had attacked her. As the investigation deepened, investigators began to look into Benjamin's behavior. Despite his tearful eulogy at the funeral and his supposed devastation, there was an odd calmness to him. No signs of shock, no outbursts of emotion like one might expect from a man who had just lost his wife. Instead, he presented a controlled, almost rehearsed demeanor. But it was Nathan who caught the attention of the investigators in a more disturbing way. Amelia's younger brother, once seen as the heartbroken sibling, had started acting strangely in the days following the funeral. He avoided eye contact with anyone, his face a mask of guilt, and he became increasingly withdrawn. He couldn't seem to look anyone in the eye, and he was often fidgety, jumping at the smallest noises. Sheriff Dawson's team zeroed in on Nathan, sensing that something wasn't quite right with him. After all, Nathan had been the last person to see Amelia alive. The investigators brought him in for questioning, hoping to piece together the truth of what had happened. Nathan, sitting in the sterile interrogation room, was shaking. His hands trembled, and his breath came in quick, shallow gasps. Sheriff Dawson sat across from him, his calm demeanor only heightening Nathan's sense of panic. The questions came slowly at first, but they soon became sharper, more direct. "Where were you when your sister died, Nathan?" the sheriff asked, his voice firm. Nathan's eyes darted toward the door, as if he was looking for an escape. I was with Benjamin. We were just talking," he stammered. The sheriff leaned forward slightly, his tone now piercing. "Did you help him, Nathan? Did you help him hurt her?" Nathan's breath hitched. He looked down, unable to meet the sheriff's gaze. The pressure in the room built, and Nathan's walls began to crumble. His head dropped into his hands, his body trembling as the truth finally seeped through his defenses. I didn't want to," Nathan whispered, his voice barely audible. "But he made me do it. I couldn't say no." The confession came in broken fragments, each word carrying a heavier weight than the last. Nathan explained how Benjamin had manipulated him, how he had preyed on his vulnerabilities, convinced him that they couldn't let anyone find out about their secret. Amelia had threatened to expose them, to tear their lives apart. Benjamin had panicked, and in that panic, he had turned violent. Nathan described how Benjamin had strangled Amelia in a fit of rage, his grip tightening around her neck until she stopped fighting back. Nathan had stood frozen, paralyzed by fear, unable to stop him. But the worst part of the confession was what followed. After Amelia had died, Benjamin had convinced Nathan to help him cover it all up. They had staged the scene, making it look like an accident, hoping to fool the authorities and the community. I'm so sorry," Nathan sobbed, his voice breaking as the confession spilled out. "I didn't know what to do. He said he'd ruin my life. I couldn't let him do that. I thought if I just helped him, everything would be okay." Nathan's breakdown was raw and uncontrollable. For the first time, the investigators saw the weight of the guilt he carried, the guilt of helping to cover up his sister's murder. The tears streamed down his face as he poured out the truth, piece by piece, his voice barely audible as he recounted every detail of that fateful night. The confession was the breakthrough the investigation needed. With Nathan's testimony, the authorities now had the evidence they needed to charge Benjamin. The manipulation, the deceit, the abuse of power, it all came to light in that small interrogation room. But the story was far from over. As news of Nathan's confession spread through the town, the community was left in shock. The man they had trusted, the man they had admired as a moral leader, was a cold-blooded murderer. The fallout was swift, with the church divided and the town struggling to come to terms with the devastating betrayal. Benjamin's arrest was only the beginning of a much larger legal and moral reckoning, one that would expose the dark underbelly of the town's religious community and shake it to its core. The arrest of Pastor Benjamin Harlow came just days after the evidence from the exhumation of Amelia's body was analyzed. Authorities moved quickly once they connected the bruises on her neck to the violent struggle, revealing that her death was not a tragic accident but a carefully concealed murder. Benjamin was arrested at his home, where he had been living under the growing pressure of the investigation. Police arrived early in the morning, catching him off guard as he tried to maintain his composure. They took him into custody without incident, but the shock of the arrest reverberated throughout the town. The man who had once been seen as a pillar of the community was now in handcuffs, facing serious charges. He was transported to the local county jail, where he was booked on charges of first-degree murder, manipulation, and grooming. As Benjamin was led into the jail, the weight of the situation set in. His once charismatic public image now crumbled, leaving only the grim reality of his crimes. He was held without bond, and his trial loomed large as the legal system prepared to hold him accountable for his actions. His arrest marked the beginning of the end for the seemingly perfect facade he had worked so hard to build, exposing the darkest secrets that had been buried beneath his role as a trusted preacher. The trial of Pastor Benjamin Harlow became a dramatic spectacle that captivated the town and the surrounding area. As the court convened, it was clear that the stakes were high. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out their case, which centered on the years of manipulation, coercion, and abuse of power that Benjamin had inflicted on both Amelia and Nathan. They painted a picture of a predator, a man who had used his position as a spiritual leader to prey on the vulnerable, especially Nathan, who had trusted him for guidance. Nathan's testimony was both heartbreaking and explosive. With shaking hands, he detailed how Benjamin had manipulated him under the guise of counseling. He spoke of the emotional and psychological control Benjamin had exerted over him, and how he had been coerced into silence, fearing both rejection from his family and condemnation from the church if the affair were ever exposed. Nathan explained how, over the years, Benjamin had taken advantage of his insecurities and struggles with his own identity, twisting their relationship into something far darker than it was ever meant to be. The courtroom was silent as Nathan recounted the moments leading up to Amelia's murder. He described the confrontation between the three of them, the escalating argument, and Benjamin's sudden, violent outburst. The defense lawyer tried to discredit Nathan, suggesting that his emotional testimony was an attempt to avoid blame for his own role in the cover-up. However, Nathan's raw honesty and vulnerability left a lasting impact on the jury, as they saw a young man who had been manipulated and used by someone in a position of authority. The prosecution's case was relentless. They outlined how Benjamin had carefully staged Amelia's death, knowing full well the consequences if the truth came out. They showed how he had premeditated the murder, taking steps to ensure that no one would suspect foul play, from the fake hiking accident to the tearful eulogy he had delivered at Amelia's funeral. The prosecution argued that this was a man who had no regard for human life, driven only by his own fear of losing his power and reputation. In contrast, Benjamin's defense team tried to portray him as a misunderstood spiritual leader who had made a terrible mistake but was ultimately a man of good intentions. They claimed that his actions with Nathan were not malicious but rather a misguided attempt to help a young man struggling with his sexuality. The defense tried to argue that Benjamin was not the manipulative predator the prosecution made him out to be, but a well-intentioned pastor who had failed to recognize the consequences of his actions. They also tried to paint Benjamin as someone who was in a moment of emotional distress, claiming that Amelia's discovery of the affair had sent him into a state of panic, which led to the violence. Despite the defense's arguments, the prosecution's evidence and Nathan's emotional testimony proved too compelling. The jury was not swayed by the defense's attempt to cast Benjamin in a sympathetic light. The truth was undeniable: Benjamin had used his position of power to manipulate Nathan, and his violent actions had led to the brutal murder of his wife. The trial concluded with the jury deliberating for several days. When they returned with a guilty verdict, the courtroom erupted in tension. Benjamin Harlow was convicted on all charges: first-degree murder, grooming, and manipulation. His sentence would come later, but it was clear that his once prominent status had been destroyed. For the people of Oakwood, the trial was not just about one man's crimes, it was a painful reminder of how easily power could be abused and how dark secrets could lie beneath the surface of even the most trusted figures. The courtroom fell into heavy silence as the jury filed back in, their faces solemn. The judge asked for the verdict to be read aloud, and as the words echoed through the room, the weight of justice was felt. Pastor Benjamin Harlow was found guilty on all charges: first-degree murder, grooming, and manipulation. The solemnity of the moment was not lost on anyone, as the man who had once stood before his congregation as a pillar of moral authority was now a convicted criminal. Benjamin stood motionless as the verdict was read, his eyes downcast, his once confident demeanor shattered. His defense team's arguments had failed to sway the jury, and the brutal reality of his actions had been too clear to ignore. The judge adjourned for a brief recess before returning to announce the sentencing. With the courtroom packed, the judge imposed the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. There were no mitigating factors, no offers for parole after a set number of years. Benjamin's life as he knew it was over. The man who had manipulated and destroyed so many lives, using his power as a pastor to exploit the vulnerable, would spend the rest of his days behind bars, a far cry from the position of reverence he had once held in the community. As Benjamin was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, there was a collective sense of closure, but also an undercurrent of sadness. Amelia was gone, and the destruction Benjamin had caused reached far beyond the loss of one life. Yet, justice had been served. Meanwhile, Nathan Collins' fate was somewhat different. Though he was also guilty of helping to cover up the murder, his role in the crime was seen as one of manipulation and fear, rather than active involvement in the murder itself. His cooperation with law enforcement, and his emotional testimony during the trial, played a significant role in securing Benjamin's conviction. As a result, Nathan was given a reduced sentence. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison for his role in the cover-up, but his sentence was reduced for his cooperation and his willingness to testify against Benjamin. Nathan's sentence was a stark contrast to Benjamin's, and the courtroom was divided in its response. Some saw him as a victim who had been coerced and manipulated for years, while others believed that, despite his manipulation, he should still face the consequences of his actions. However, Nathan's path to redemption remained uncertain. His sentence was a reminder that while he was a victim of manipulation, he still had to answer for his involvement in the cover-up. As both men were led away, one facing a life behind bars, the other with a chance at eventual release, the town of Oakwood was left to pick up the pieces. The scandal had ripped through the fabric of the community, leaving deep scars. But in the end, justice had been served, and both Benjamin and Nathan were forced to face the consequences of their actions. Amelia Collins' life was one of devotion and faith, but her tragic death revealed the devastating betrayal she faced from the man she loved and trusted. Her untimely end left a gaping hole in her family, as her parents were left to mourn not only her loss but the shocking truth behind it. The community was torn apart by the scandal. Congregants, once loyal to the charismatic pastor Benjamin Harlow, found themselves questioning the very foundation of their faith. The fall of such a revered leader shattered the church's reputation, leaving its members divided and disillusioned. What had once been a source of comfort and guidance now felt like a betrayal, as trust was eroded and the congregation struggled to make sense of the truth. The case raised profound questions about the abuse of power, the manipulation of vulnerable individuals, and the stigma surrounding LGBTQ+ relationships in conservative communities. It illuminated the dark reality of how authority figures can prey on those they're meant to protect, leaving long-lasting scars on victims, families, and entire communities. Amelia's tragic story is a chilling reminder of the dark secrets that can hide behind a facade of faith and trust. It calls for accountability, justice, and support for those who fall victim to manipulation and abuse. Thank you for watching Real True Crime Stories. Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping true crime stories. We honor the lives of those lost, and we remain committed to telling their stories with the respect and truth they deserve.